This is Sri Lanka, a country which is currently embroiled in economic turmoil, with foreign reserves depleting rapidly, and political instability growing. There are concerns whether this country will survive this crisis or not. However, in this video we will not be entirely focusing on the Sri Lankan economy as a whole, rather we will only discuss the catastrophic decisions regarding the economy of Sri Lanka which have pressed the country deeper into the crisis. The situation in Sri Lanka is so critical that the government had to suspend operations at its only fuel refinery because it ran out of crude oil stocks. Let's first talk about the farming disaster by Sri Lankan government. Faced with a deepening economic and humanitarian crisis, Sri Lanka called off an ill-conceived national experiment in organic agriculture. Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa promised in his 2019 election campaign to transition the country's farmers to organic agriculture. Fulfilling his manifesto, the president imposed a nationwide ban on the importation and use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and ordering the country's 2 million farmers to go organic. The result was brutal and swift. Against claims that organic methods can produce comparable yields to conventional farming, domestic rice production fell 20% in just the first 6 months. Sri Lanka, long self-sufficient in rice production, has been forced to import $450 million worth of rice even as domestic prices for this staple of the national diet surged by around 50%. The ban also devastated the nation's tea crop, its primary export and source of foreign exchange. Faced with angry protests, soaring inflation, and the collapse of Sri Lanka's currency, the government finally suspended the policy for several key crops, including tea, rubber, and coconut, last month, although it continues for some others. The government is also offering $200 million to farmers as direct compensation and an additional $149 million in price subsidies to rice farmers who incurred losses. That hardly made up for the damage and suffering the ban produced. Farmers have widely criticized the payments for being massively insufficient and excluding many farmers, most notably tea producers, who offer one of the main sources of employment in rural Sri Lanka. The drop in tea production alone is estimated to result in economic losses of $425 million. Pandemic is also a major reason. Prior to the COVID-19's outbreak, the country had proudly achieved upper middle income status. Tourism has dropped as a result of the pandemic as the world went into lockdown. The recent Russia-Ukraine conflict further damaged the tourism industry as the Russians and Ukrainians comprise of around 25% of inbound tourists in Sri Lanka. Skyrocketed oil prices exacerbated the economic pressure onto the fragile Sri Lankan economy. Today, 500,000 people have sunk back into poverty. Soaring inflation and a rapidly depreciating currency have forced Sri Lankans to cut down on food and fuel purchases as prices surge. The country's economists have called on the government to default on its debt repayments to buy essential supplies for its people. A severe shortage of foreign currency has left Rajapaksa's government unable to pay for essential imports, including fuel, leading to debilitating power cuts lasting up to 13 hours. Ordinary Sri Lankans are also dealing with shortages and soaring inflation, after the country steeply devalued its currency last month ahead of talks with the International Monetary Fund (IMF) for a loan program. The roots of the crisis, the worst in several decades, lie in economic mismanagement by successive governments that created and sustained a twin deficit, a budget shortfall alongside a current account deficit. However, Sri Lanka was a fragile economy even before the pandemic. Sri Lanka exports tea, cinnamon, spices, rubber, coconut, sea products, gems and garments. It imports most of the items, including a bulk of its food items, capital goods, automobiles and pharmaceuticals. Sri Lankans working abroad send $3 to $4 billion home annually. Tourism employs over 3 million, generating $4 to $5 billion a year. Sri Lanka was heavily dependent on these inflows. The successive governments made no serious efforts to build manufacturing and domestically dependent service sector in the country. Sri Lanka is a classic twin deficits economy, said a 2019 Asian Development Bank working paper. Twin deficits signal that a country's national expenditure exceeds its national income, and that its production of tradable goods and services is inadequate. But the current crisis was accelerated by deep tax cuts promised by Rajapaksa during a 2019 election campaign that were enacted months before the COVID-19 pandemic, which wiped out parts of Sri Lanka's economy. With the country's lucrative tourism industry and foreign workers' remittances sapped by the pandemic, credit ratings agencies moved to downgrade Sri Lanka and effectively locked it out of international capital markets. In turn, Sri Lanka's debt management program, which depended on accessing those markets, derailed and foreign exchange reserves plummeted by almost 70% in 2 years. As of February, the country was left with only $2.31 billion in its reserves but faces debt repayments of around $4 billion in 2022, including a $1 billion international sovereign bond (ISB) maturing in July. ISBs make up the largest share of Sri Lanka's foreign debt at $12.55 billion, with the Asian Development Bank, Japan and China among the other major lenders. In a review of the country's economy released last month, the IMF said that public debt had risen to unsustainable levels, and foreign exchange reserves were insufficient for near-term debt payments. In a note late last month, Citi Research said that the IMF report's conclusion and the government's recent measures were insufficient to restore debt sustainability, strongly indicating the need for debt restructuring. So, who is helping Sri Lanka? For months, Rajapaksa's administration and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka (CBSL) resisted calls by experts and opposition leaders to seek help from the IMF despite rising risks. But after oil prices soared in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in late February, the government eventually drew up a plan to approach the IMF in April. The IMF will initiate discussions with Sri Lankan authorities on a possible loan program in coming days, an IMF spokesman said on Thursday. Before heading to the IMF, Sri Lanka steeply devalued its currency, further stoking inflation and adding to the pain of the public, many of whom are enduring hardship and long queues. In the interim, Rajapaksa has also sought help from China and India, particularly assistance on fuel from the latter. A diesel shipment under a $500 million credit line signed with India in February is expected to arrive in the country soon. Sri Lanka and India have signed a $1 billion credit line for importing essentials, including food and medicine, and the Rajapaksa government has sought at least another $1 billion from New Delhi. After providing the CBSL with a $1.5 billion swap and a $1.3 billion syndicated loan to the government, China is considering offering the island nation a $1.5 billion credit facility and a loan of up to $1 billion. It doesn't look like that Sri Lanka will ever be able to pay these debts. My assessment is that severe restructuring of Sri Lankan economy is needed. We are hearing reports of Sri Lankan fleeing to India as economic migrants. This is very dangerous for Sri Lanka as the country is stuck at a difficult phase. Please let us know in the comment section, what do you think the Sri Lankan government shall do? How should they maneuver their country to prosperity? So that is it for the Sri Lankan economy today. Do leave a like if you enjoyed this video and comment down your suggestions. Subscribe to stay updated and share our videos. Till then, goodbye.